And with that, I would now like to formally begin today's conference and introduce Karen Sinclair.
Thank you. So welcome everybody to the WREN webinar series. Just as background, WREN is an IEA International Energy Agency WIN task, formerly known as Task 34, but we refer to it as WREN, which means working together to resolve the environmental effects of wind energy. So we began the WREN webinar series late 2014, back in September. And the purpose of this webinar series is to support the goals, at least some of the goals of WREN, which in this case are to facilitate the international collaboration to advance the global understanding of environmental effects of offshore and land-based wind energy, and to create a shared global knowledge base and community of practice around monitoring and management of the environmental effects of wind energy development. Next. Next, thank you. So since we initiated or kicked off this webinar series in 2014, we've held 4 webinars. The first was in September 14, and it focused on assessing the impact of wind energy development on bats. In December of last year, we held a webinar that looked at the research efforts to measure seabird and marine mammal attraction and avoidance at offshore wind farms. And then in April of this year, we had a webinar that focused on avian collision rate modeling and what this means in the population context. And our last webinar in August of this year focused on avian sensitivity mapping and wind energy projects. Next. And so today is our 5th in the series, and our topic is wildlife monitoring and wind energy. We have 2 presenters, Kate Williams from the Biodiversity Research Institute and Heinrich Skov from the DHI group. This presentation will focus on tools and approaches that have been developed or are used to monitor wildlife at existing and potential wind energy development sites, both onshore and offshore. And the results of this webinar will be, or the recordings will be posted. There's a link on this slide that will direct you to that. And also I should say that the BRI presentation is complementary to a presentation that was given last month, and we've also included the link on this slide. That particular webinar focused on the geographic and temporal pattern of wildlife distributions observed at a project that they're leading in the Mid-Atlantic Baseline Study Project is what it's called. So you can go back and look at that webinar to get some additional information on the BRI project. Next slide, please. And so today we have 2 presenters, as I mentioned. Kate Williams. Kate is the Wildlife and Renewable Energy Director at the Biodiversity Research Institute, which is a nonprofit scientific research organization based in Maine. Her research has focused on survey methodologies and biases in studies of populations, and also understanding wildlife movements, distributions, and habitat use in relation to environmental variables and anthropogenic stressors. She has degrees from Tufts University and the University of Florida, and she's been managing a series of large-scale projects that are focused on contaminants and then wildlife and wind interaction issues. And our second speaker is Heinrich Skov, and he has more than 30 years of experience in the application of field and analytical methods for assessing the effects of human activities at sea on marine birds. He's managed several strategic studies and has a wealth of background in this area. He's been involved in more than 60 marine impact assessments. The method development and innovation with impact assessment has included multi-sensor detection systems, dynamic habitat modeling, remote sensing, sensitivity mapping and GIS-based decision support systems. Suffice it to say, both of these speakers have a tremendous amount of experience, and so I'm really looking forward to the presentations here. Next slide. So I would say that this webinar series is developed to provide, as I mentioned, information dissemination, and so we are looking to the audience and participants to give us ideas on what would be of interest to you going forward. We have identified a number of topics for future webinars, which you can see listed on this slide, including development tools, mitigation, compensation, uncertainty and risk, environmental regulation and practices. WREN Hub is a platform for information. We will probably be doing a webinar on the functions, features, and capabilities of WREN Hub. And then under WREN, we are also developing a number of white papers on very strategic topics. And once those papers are completed, we anticipate holding webinars on those papers as well. But again, I'm encouraging people to reach out and give us additional ideas. If you have speakers in mind, that would also be much appreciated. Next slide. So finally, this is my last slide. I want to send you to the WREN website for information on the webinar series, recordings that have already been posted, and also other information that we have on WREN. And you can contact me or other people on our team that are leading this effort. And so with that, I would like to turn the speaker over to Kate Williams, who will present on her topic.
Thank you for being here today. I'll be talking about a research effort that we started in 2011 that's aimed at informing the development of offshore wind energy in the United States by gathering multiple years of baseline monitoring data on wildlife on the mid-Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf. I have a long list of co-authors for this talk, including folks from BRI as well as North Carolina State University, the College of Staten Island, Duke University, Oregon State, and the University of Oklahoma. And I'll try to call out their contributions as I talk about various project components, but most of what we're discussing today is the result of collaborative efforts among multiple organizations. This project was funded by the Department of Energy Wind and Water Power Technologies Office, as well as the state of Maryland, and support for certain project components has also come from a variety of other sources, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, CEDEX Joint Venture, and private foundations. And in addition to co-authors for this talk today, we have a lot of collaborators and partners, particularly for the seabird telemetry work, which has actually been part of two multi-year ongoing projects on the movement patterns of red-throated loons, northern gannets, and surf scoters in the Atlantic Flyway. So these projects should be finishing, or at least one of them, I guess, is finishing up next year, and was developed by BOEM and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Birds Division, the other by CEDEX Joint Venture, including state and federal partners in the U.S. and Canada. Our goal for this study was to build a baseline of ecological knowledge that regulators, developers, and other stakeholders for offshore wind energy could use for siting and permitting offshore wind facilities on the mid-Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf. Our focus was on potential exposure, so a baseline understanding of what species are present and in what numbers and could be exposed to development activities in the mid-Atlantic. An interesting thing about this project is that we were able to use a variety of different methods and focus in part on evaluating the strengths of various approaches as well as improving existing analytical methods for future application. And so this use of some new technologies and analytical approaches and the mix of technologies that we applied were really important contributions from this study, I think. So I'll be focusing on some of these technologies and methods today. We conducted both high-resolution digital video aerial surveys and boat-based surveys. Boat surveys are a traditional and widely used method for monitoring wildlife offshore, and our study was the first in the U.S. To deploy digital video aerial survey methods on a broad scale, though these methods have become quite common in relation to offshore wind energy development in Europe in recent years. So we focused quite a bit on comparing results from the boat and video aerial surveys to try and understand the differences between them, as well as on the potential for integrating data from both survey methods. And I'll also discuss several other studies we implemented in the Mid-Atlantic, the types of data we were able to obtain from these methods relative to survey approaches, and I'll briefly highlight some of the analytical work that's being conducted by collaborators primarily at North Carolina State University. It's focused on approaches for dealing with low sample sizes for rare species and on developing integrated models that incorporate data from both boat and aerial surveys. This is our study area in the Mid-Atlantic United States, offshore of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, from 3 miles offshore east to the 30-meter isobath. So the only surveys that occurred in state waters within 3 miles of shore occurred offshore of northern Maryland. So the work was almost entirely in federal waters. And this study area contains 3 of the first 4 federally designated wind energy areas in the United States. The total study area in gray here is about 13,000 square kilometers. And then the box that you see offshore of Maryland included some additional survey effort funded by the state of Maryland during the second year of surveys. Fieldwork was mostly conducted in 2012 to 2014. And I have both boat and aerial survey transects on this map here, but I'll walk through them in more detail next. So first, we conducted 15 boat surveys over the 2 years, about 560 kilometers of transects, which are shown in blue and red and are really focused around the 3 wind energy areas. The project boat surveys were run by Richard Vita at the College of Staten Island according to established protocols. So during surveys, teams of 2 observers rotated and used a combination of strip and line transect methods to observe and record animals. They recorded the location, abundance, and behaviors of animals, as well as the distance and angle to each animal from the vessel, so that during modeling we could correct for the failure to observe animals farther away from the vessel. The boat had an intended minimum 300-meter transect strip width, but observations of animals were made up to 1,000 meters away, and due to the relatively slow survey speed, about 19 kilometers an hour, boat-based observers could record detailed data on species identities, abundance, and behaviors. We also completed 15 high-resolution digital video aerial surveys. These were conducted by High-Def Aerial Surveying Limited in the United Kingdom. They're a company that developed this approach in Europe. And our study design for these surveys included intensive surveys with 1 kilometer transect spacing in and around the wind energy areas, and those are shown in black and gray on this map. And then there's a broader scale sawtooth transect throughout the entire study area to provide to the broader context. So we had over 3,600 kilometers of transect, including the Maryland extension surveys offshore Maryland in the second year. These surveys were flown in twin-engine Cessnas, fitted with 4 belly-mounted cameras that record non-overlapping strip transects. And the video records about 8 frames a second in each frame from each camera is georeferenced. The aircraft flies at an average speed of about 135 knots and at 610 meters above sea level, so much higher than visual aerial surveys, which tend to be more at the 100 to 600 feet range, depending on the study, which means that digital aerial surveys tend to be much safer for those aboard and also don't disturb wildlife being surveyed the same way that low-flying visual aerial surveys can. Analysis of the video is a multi-step process to isolate targets in the video, estimate flight height for flying animals, and identify objects to species or species grouping. And both the object location and identification processes have a detailed quality assurance and quality control protocol with blind re-reviews of 20% of the video or objects. And this image here, you can see a bottlenose dolphin under the water, and then a northern gannet, and a measuring tool that we're using to estimate animal size. And here are some other examples from the high-definition video. We can come back to this later if anyone's interested. Some of these are just screenshots from the video, so they're not as high quality as images as the video itself, but it gives you an idea of what we're seeing. In March of 2013, we experimentally compared results of simultaneous boat and high-resolution digital video aerial surveys. There's a pretty different field of view between boat observers and then the cameras on the survey plane. So the boat observers are looking out across the water surface, and then the cameras on the plane are looking at about a 30 to 45 degree angle downwards towards the water surface. The boat is also, as I mentioned, surveying at a speed of about 19 kilometers or 10 knots per hour, and the plane's normal transect speed is 135 knots. So given these differences in speed between the two platforms, the plane actually ended up following the boat transect repeatedly while the boat was on it. And so the plane was surveying areas on the transect both before and after the boat had passed through it. And its inset map shows where the comparison study occurred on two transects that were broken up into 25 segments for analysis. And these transects were located near the mouth of Chesapeake Bay off of Virginia. For several analyses, we focused on the two most abundant species groups observed in the surveys, northern gannets and scoters, mostly black and surf scoters. I'm not going to go into detail on these analytical methods, but the two survey approaches each had, I think, some clear strengths and weaknesses. First off, using just the raw counts from each survey method, we examined our ability to identify animals to species in boat versus aerial surveys. So we lumped observations by family, and then within each family group, we looked at the proportion of observations in which animals were identified to the species level, so say common loon, versus the group level, which would be unidentified loon. We had lower rates of identification of animals to the species level in the aerial survey than in the boat survey for many groups, including gulls and loons. Northern gannets and dolphins were highly identifiable using both survey methods. And scoters were the one taxonomic group in this comparison study in which identification of species was actually significantly easier from the aerial video than from the boat. And that may be partly due to the effects of disturbance from the survey vessel, because most scoters were observed far enough away from the survey boat that it ended up being difficult to differentiate between black and surf scoters. Because the aerial survey included multiple replicates of each transect while the boat was on it, we obtained data from the same locations from both before and after the boat had passed through. And so we developed generalized linear models for scoters and gannets and found that the boat didn't disturb gannets so far as we could tell in this study, but scoters did show a significantly negative relationship to the boat disturbance, with an estimated 21% fewer scoters present in segments that the boat had passed through recently. We also developed estimates of population size for the 25 transect segments for scoters and northern gannets. Distance-corrected boat estimates were pretty consistently higher than bootstrapped aerial estimates. Both survey methods picked up on a similar geographic distribution pattern for scoters, but gannet abundance estimates from the two methods were less correlated by transect segment. And we think that may be related to the poor spatial coverage of the aerial surveys in this design. We normally flew higher density aerial transects to make up for their sort of narrower transect strip width as opposed to the boat surveys. But it seemed like at the transect spacing of the boat, which was used for both surveys in this comparison study, aerial surveys may have been inconsistent at observing highly mobile species like northern gannets. And there was also an exact temporal overlap between the methodologies, and so particularly for aerial replicates that were conducted well before or well after the boat's passage through a given segment, it's likely that individual gannets were observed in slightly different locations between the boat and aerial surveys. So bottom line is that both survey methodologies have some limitations. I will say the newer generation of cameras now being used for video aerial surveys in Europe have a wider transect strip width and better image resolution and color rendition than the cameras we used in this study, which I think is ameliorating some of the issues we observed. The other thing I would point out is that there isn't a great approach yet for formally accounting for detection or availability bias with digital aerial survey data. It hasn't really been addressed in the literature for digital aerial surveys, but it's a topic that I think deserves further work because it's clear that boat surveys have some limitations, and there are some things about the digital aerial survey approach that make it a promising method for continued use in the offshore environment. So moving beyond this focused comparison study that we conducted, I'm going to show a few results from the full 2 years of surveys now. Overall, across the 2 years of surveys, wintering scoters were the most abundant animal group observed in boat surveys. They're about a third of all observations. Scoters were also the most abundant avian group in aerial surveys, but the most commonly observed animal overall in aerial surveys was actually rays. We had more species of animals that were definitely identified to species from the boat, 109 species from the boat as opposed to 67 from the air. And aerial rates of species identification were lower, with the exception of scoters. In particular, we had difficulty differentiating common and red-throated loons due to their widely overlapping body sizes for birds that winter in the mid-Atlantic, which is kind of unexpected. It's not an issue that has really been seen too much in Europe, but it ended up being a problem for differentiating these two species for the populations wintering in the mid-Atlantic U.S. This graph here is a comparison of total effort-corrected boat and aerial survey counts across all surveys for selected taxa. The aerial densities are calculated using the actual transect strip widths, and the boat densities are calculated using estimated strip widths for each taxon. If you recall from the transect maps, boat and aerial transects were in slightly different locations. They also had some different timing. They weren't occurring in exactly the same dates, which does make it a little hard to do an apples-to-apples comparison. But in general, there were more birds observed per unit of survey effort in the boat survey, while digital aerial surveys seem to be particularly good for observing aquatic taxa in the upper reaches of the water column, including turtles, sharks, fish, and rays. And some of these contrasts in survey results do suggest some differences in detectability between the survey types, possibly due to observer perspective or transect strip width, as well as to maybe reduced disturbance from the high-flying plane as compared to the boat. In particular, we had much higher counts and species diversity of sea turtles in digital video aerial surveys than we did from the boat, and a similar efficiency in detecting sea turtles as compared to either boat surveys or visual aerial surveys was observed in another recent study, the only other test of digital aerial survey approaches that I think has occurred to date in the U.S. Since there are not a lot of sea turtles in northern Europe, this isn't an advantage of digital aerial survey approaches that I think has been widely recognized to date, but this is definitely a survey approach that should be considered for future sea turtle monitoring in the United States. We also observed major migrations of Cownose Rays and other rays in the aerial surveys that mostly went undetected in the boat surveys. We saw almost 48,000 rays in aerial surveys overall. And aerial surveys have been used to study the species in Chesapeake Bay, but we really know very little about their migration in the open ocean. So this was really unexpected to see such huge numbers of them migrating through the mid-Atlantic offshore area. So we can talk about this more later if folks are interested, but basically each survey method has some advantages and disadvantages in terms of cost, logistics, types of data that can be produced, and the biases associated with those data. Digital video aerial surveys covered large areas quickly, didn't disturb wildlife, and produced archivable data. Boat surveys provided more detailed data on species identities and behavior. It does seem like there's good potential to take advantages of the strengths of both survey types and develop integrated models of animal distribution and abundance, although we need to be thoughtful about how that's done, and I'll touch on that again in a bit. As I mentioned earlier, most of the satellite telemetry studies are still ongoing. We should start seeing final reports next year. But I want to briefly mention them here because satellite telemetry individual tracking results are so different from survey data. And we also conducted 2 different studies focused on understanding nocturnal migratory activity offshore. And so this is trying to figure out ways to survey birds migrating at night, many of them land birds, that aren't very well surveyed using daytime survey approaches. Tracking techniques, like attaching satellite transmitters to individual animals, allow us to obtain detailed information on the movement patterns of individuals. So that satellite transmitters are sending data on locations of individuals during predetermined periods of the day. We deploy transmitters on these 4 species that make use of the study area during wintering or migration periods. Birds were captured at several locations along the east coast of North America, and transmitters were attached to birds either externally or were surgically implanted. For seabirds, we deployed tags mostly in the winter and mostly actually on the open ocean, which hadn't been done before for either red-throated loons or gannets. And we mostly use implants, which are common for marine birds, although it was the first time that they'd been used for northern gannets. Before that, and for some of the tags in this study as well, the tags were tail-mounted, and you can see that image here. But then when the bird molts its tail, you lose the tag. And so using surgically implanted transmitters was a step forward for being able to obtain year-round information on gannet movements. So you end up with a series of points where the transmitter fixes the bird's location and then have to try to interpolate the bird's movements between those points. You do get information on population connectivity with individual tracking that you can't get with survey data. So you can track the birds year-round. You know where they're migrating, wintering, or breeding when they're not in the study area. And we were also able to get some information on nocturnal movements and on individual home range size that are really complementary to survey results, which are limited to daylight hours and also represent just basically a snapshot of where animals are at a given point in time, rather than defining how much they're moving around. We also examined 2 approaches for obtaining data on nocturnal migration patterns and species composition in the offshore environment. We utilized passive acoustic recorders on the vessel used for boat surveys. So in this image here, the microphone's actually at the top of that pole. And this was to detect nocturnal migratory flight calls from passenger and shorebirds and other migrants offshore. These flight calls often have a unique sonogram that you can differentiate from each other. So we only recorded a few nights of acoustic data from the survey boat while it was anchored offshore of Maryland and Virginia. This was really a pilot study, but they work pretty well. In addition to detections of non-migratory flight calls for seabirds, which, as you would expect, were pretty common, we also detected migratory flight calls from at least 15 species of passerines and shorebirds, including warblers, sparrows, thrushes, etc., mostly during a single night in September 2012, 40 miles offshore of Maryland. So this method does show some promise as a way to examine species composition of nocturnal migrants in the offshore environment. Our other method for examining nocturnal migration patterns was to use WSR-88D weather radar, also known as NEXRAD radar. Weather radars send microwaves into the atmosphere to detect precipitation. And these microwaves also indicate the locations of flying animals, such as birds, bats, and insects. So during migration, blooms of migratory activity can be seen surrounding radar units on unfiltered radar maps. So that's the top image here is unfiltered. Normally, you take that top image and filter out the bioscatter, sort of the animals in there, to get the bottom image, which is just the meteorological activity. In our study, our collaborator at the University of Oklahoma actually developed an approach to reverse filter the data, so filtering out the storms to just get the biological activity, which is slightly different than previous NEXRAD biological studies and gave us a much larger sample size to work with over the 6 migration seasons we examined. So with the NEXRAD data, we ended up developing models to compare migratory activity at locations around 6 radars located from New York to North Carolina. So the radars were located at the center of each of these sort of series of circles on the map. And the sites were located over land and out to 80 kilometers at sea. And for each of those study sites, we developed an average measure of migratory reflectivity for each night during spring and fall. And then we're able to use these nightly values in seasonal generalized linear models to try and understand the predictors of migratory activity. So distance to shore was one variable in the model, wind data, year, elevation of the site, distance from the radar, et cetera, were also there. So in addition to filtering out weather data in the study, which was a new capability, this modeling approach also allowed us to correct for certain factors that would otherwise have biased our estimates of migratory activity between sites. So site elevation is one of those factors, but it's pretty minor in the mid-Atlantic. There's not too much elevation change in coastal areas. The bigger issue is actually distance of each site from the radar. So with increasing distance from the radar unit, the radar beam increases in elevation, and sites over the ocean are mostly farther away from the radar. So that's actually a bias that requires correction before you can reliably compare migratory activity between locations. So our NEXRAD monitoring was successful in describing migratory activity at low altitudes over the ocean. Often the units could detect activity 82 meters above sea level. So we were looking at pretty relevant altitudes for understanding migration patterns in relation to offshore wind turbine rotor sweep zones. And we saw high levels of daily variation in migratory activity related in part to wind conditions. But after controlling for weather and for biases in measured levels of migratory activity, we also were able to see some more persistent patterns. So offshore activity was much higher in fall than in spring, for example. Neither nocturnal passive acoustic monitoring or the analysis of NEXRAD weather radar data allow for estimation of actual animal abundance. And NEXRAD data aren't species specific, but together these approaches start to provide some information on offshore migration at night during a time of day when visual surveys aren't possible. So by using these 5 research methods I've discussed, we were able to develop a more complete picture of wildlife populations in the Mid-Atlantic study region. And the colors here represent relative quality of each study method for developing data in various categories. These values are subjective. So, for example, detection bias was not directly quantified for aerial surveys in our study, but detection of avian species in our boat surveys did appear to be better than digital video aerial surveys in many cases, at least after correction for distance bias in boat data. So we categorize boat surveys as good for this type of data, while digital video aerial surveys were considered fair. Surveys are fairly comprehensive in terms of the types of information they can provide, which is why they're a common study approach offshore. But the other approaches, the three over on the right, filled in important gaps in information obtained from surveys. So in particular, some of the main weaknesses of surveys are temporal coverage, because surveys are conducted at specified intervals and aren't continuous, and also obtaining information on animal movement patterns and on nocturnal animal locations. So I'm going to walk through a few example maps now and compare sort of the types of results you get from the different study methods and analytical approaches. So this is just a raw sort of point map showing where observations were made. And then on the left here you have persistent hotspots. So these maps used effort-corrected boat and digital video aerial survey data aggregated across all surveys to try and illustrate where the highest numbers of animals were most consistently observed. And this presentation corrects for variation in effort between each of those little grid cells, but it doesn't address detection bias. And so colors range from no color, which was never a hotspot, to red, which is in the 95th percentile for persistence of hotspots across all cells and surveys in which a taxon is present. The middle map here is predicted abundance, a seasonal predicted abundance map. That's an output from either a generalized linear model or a generalized additive model. And so these models use effort and bias-corrected survey data from either boat surveys or digital video aerial surveys in combination with environmental covariate data to predict seasonal animal distribution abundance across the entire study area, including areas that weren't directly surveyed during the study. This example is boat survey data to use to predict abundance of northern gannets for a given date in the winter of 2013-2014. And the advantage to this kind of analysis is that you're able to account for different kinds of bias associated with data collection, including variation in effort and distance bias, which is a common issue in boat surveys. And then you can also use relationships to habitat variables to predict distributions and locations other than when we actually surveyed. On the right here, this is a utilization distribution map, which is derived from the satellite telemetry data. And so this is estimating core use areas where tagged individuals spent the majority of their time. While survey data provide kind of a snapshot of information on population distribution, these utilization distribution maps are characterizing the movements and habitat use of a group of individuals over time. So these are different data sets and analytical approaches. The predictive model allows you to identify the potential drivers in north and gannet distributions. Hotspot and model output maps also did a better job of identifying, I think, sort of fine scale variation in abundance and habitat use patterns. But the telemetry data, you can include distributions in the bays and inland areas where we didn't survey, and can help identify some individual movement patterns that aren't captured in the other approaches. All right, I need to start wrapping up here, but very briefly I want to highlight some analytical work being conducted by collaborators at North Carolina State University focused on approaches for dealing with low sample sizes for rare species and on integrating results from multiple study components. I already just discussed seasonal predicted abundance maps, but we use data from boat and aerial surveys as environmental covariate data in hierarchical models to try and understand factors that might be influencing species distributions and relative abundance. And this was overseen by Beth Gardner at NC State University and Dave Johnston at Duke. And a couple of specific efforts that they worked on are pretty interesting. So distance sampling generally requires a minimum sample size in order to produce valid results. And so with the data collected in the boat surveys, it was pretty common to have, say, fewer than 30 observations of a single species, particularly if you split data by season. So in order to estimate the abundance of those species with smaller sample sizes, the lab at NC State developed a new multi-species model for distance sampling and applied it to the seabird data from our boat surveys. And so this model allowed abundance to vary with environmental covariates, but also allowed for species-specific parameters that came from a common underlying distribution. And so the hierarchical model structure enabled us to incorporate species with sparse data sets that otherwise just would have been discarded from analysis, and allowed us to make inference about the ecology of the entire marine bird community, but also individual species, including rarely observed species that may be particularly important in a regulatory context. And this model was applied to a set of 40 marine bird species to quantify habitat and community associations and estimate distributions and absolute abundance. As I mentioned earlier, common and red-throated loons wintering in the mid-Atlantic had a wide overlap in body size, and we had relatively poor species identification rates for this taxon in the digital video aerial surveys. So these actually provided a test case for using our boat-based species identifications to inform aerial models and develop spatially explicit species-specific estimates of relative abundance. And we ended up using a model formulation that was developed by Beth's lab at NC State to predict the identities of unidentified loons in the aerial data, and then use combine that with the species-specific boat data and actually use that to develop these persistent hotspot maps for each individual species instead of just loons as a whole. And Beth's lab has also pursued some more involved integrated modeling approaches in which predictions of marine bird abundance and distribution were jointly informed by aerial surveys, which encompass a large geographic area, and boat surveys, which allow for estimation of detection probability. And I'm not going to, I don't think, go into that further right now, but additional exploration and model development is needed, but our initial results indicate that joint modeling approaches may be a fruitful avenue for continued research. So overall, our experience in the Mid-Atlantic suggests that distribution and abundance of wildlife is driven by several environmental variables. We observed some persistent patterns both through time and across taxa, but there were also large amounts of variation between individual species, seasons, and years. And there's no sort of free lunch in terms of a survey method or a study method that gets you every kind of information you might want. And so a combination of study approaches that have complementary strengths and address the priorities for a particular site may often be the strongest approach. So, for example, while boat-based and digital video aerial surveys each had specific advantages and disadvantages, they were largely complementary. And digital aerial surveys may be particularly useful for covering offshore areas at broad scales, where general distributions of taxonomic groups are a priority. And boat surveys in our study were able to provide more detailed data on species identities and behaviors, but were more limited in geographic scope due to their slower survey pace. In addition to providing baseline wildlife data for the Mid-Atlantic, the technological and analytical developments from the study will hopefully contribute towards study design and analysis of future studies in a wide range of situations. And if you want more information, the full final report is up on the project website and also on the thesis database. And the survey data is also publicly available for download. And if there's anything particular you're interested, don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly. My email address is here. And thank you to the Department of Energy, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and Maryland Energy Administration, and all of our collaborators. And thank you all for your time today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. It looks like we have a couple questions. I think maybe what we'll do is just take one and then move on to Henrik's presentation, and then we can hopefully address some more of the questions at the end. So of the 4 bird species you tracked with individual telemetry, how far did you observe birds offshore, and could these long-shore distances be correlated to any events, such as time of day, weather, nearby vessels, etc.?
Yeah, so interestingly, probably the species that we saw farthest offshore were peregrine falcons, which I would not have predicted, but we had some individuals, one in particular, a young male, that went out to the middle of the Atlantic, like halfway to the Azores, and started barge hopping. So we could see it in the telemetry data where it would clearly it was roosting on a boat, so it was going in a straight line very slowly, like slower than the bird could fly for, say, a day or so. And then all of a sudden it would make a big jump and fly down for a while. And then would start moving really slowly in a straight line again. So it was out there roosting on, boats, whatever it could find to roost on, and was hunting from there. And that bird went way offshore. We also saw some interesting behaviors in relation to Hurricane Sandy, which came up the coast in the first fall of our telemetry studies. We saw some interesting patterns of peregrine falcon movements in relation to the storm. But there were pretty widespread movements from a lot of our species. Northern gannets in particular tended to have pretty broad-scale movements, even within winter when they were staying in the mid-Atlantic. But over the course of a day, they'd move from Delaware down to North Carolina and then back again. So we saw a lot more movement, I think, than I was expecting for some species. Scoters were a little bit less highly mobile than that, I would say.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Kate. And I guess let's move on to Henrik for now, and then hopefully we'll have some more time for questions at the end of his presentation as well.
So hello everybody, I hope you can see my screen clearly. So I'm happy to share some experiences from Europe with respect to developing detection systems that will make it possible for us to actually monitor what goes on post-construction in a wind farm in terms of bird movements. This is a development that has mainly been carried out during one recent project, and this is still ongoing, so a lot of this information is confidential, so I'll not be able to share any results with you, but I can give you the background, I can give you sort of the history of developing and the system and the background for actually choosing the different sensors, and show you also the method and the functionality of the system. So just a few words about DHI. I guess very few of you know DHI. We're not actually Danish, but the main office is in Denmark. We are an INC with representation to offices in 30 countries, including the US. And our sort of core business is software development. We are non-profit, and we use the software for different types of decision support systems, including sensor systems like this detection system. Over the last 10 years, we've been involved in many different bird and bat monitoring projects. And of course, over the last 5 years, focus has been a lot on offshore wind. And radars have really been the mainstay of these projects. We've used many different types of radars, but also other sensors. This slide just shows you an array of different projects, offshore projects that focus on offshore wind. And in general, the bird radar systems that are available today, they are also the systems that we have been using. Originally, like 10 years ago, a lot of the focus was on getting traffic rates. So using radars automatically generate sort of abundances or patterns of distributions of targets for which you didn't have any information about species. And then the methodology gradually develops into tracking systems where you actually use an observer with the radar in order to get the species IDs. One particular project that has given us a lot of experience with types of radars is a planned link between Denmark and Germany across the Baltic Sea. It was planned as a bridge in 2008. Actually, the plan has changed now to a tunnel, but it's still given us many years of radar applications and comparisons between different systems and their capacity. So the different radars include the sort of plain beam, the surveillance radar that has been used in many bird radar studies. We also used solid beam radars. We used scanning radars and weather radars as well. So radars work on very different spatial scales and resolutions. And in relation to actually understanding bird movements or patterns around an offshore wind farm, we have found that you can actually, if you can extract the LLO signal from the surveillance radar, it will provide you with very good data for the price. Of course, you can get higher resolution data, for example, with a tracking radar, but at the same time, it comes with another price. So the cost efficiency aspect has been very important for us, at least. In the early days, just getting a migration pattern like this made us very happy. So you see here a temporal pattern with nocturnal migration being much more intense than diurnal migration. And of course, birds flying at high altitudes during the night as compared to during the day. This was the kind of pattern that was generated using just radars in automated mode. And we also receive patterns like these, where you see some sort of geography. In this case, it's actually migration directions during the night that have been recorded by the radar, but without any species content. And it soon became clear to us that we, in order to actually meet the requirements in terms of sort of the legal requirements and also the requirements in relation to being able to answer the different questions related to impacts on different species, we actually need to have information at the species level. So I would say over the last 7 or 8 years, focus has been on tracking data, tracking movements of birds at the species level. And in most projects, we had actually done that by operating the radar with an observer. So the observer actually follows the bird, identifies species, and get all the different details into the database, and that is then the data we use for extracting the statistics on movements. And of course, as long as your project is fairly close to this this system works. But as soon as we actually started working with offshore wind farms and started assessing collision risks, it became clear that it was very difficult to get access, very difficult to get on, for example, the transformer piece or another platform in the wind farm due to restrictions and also simply due to real difficulties working in an offshore environment in windy conditions. But this is an example of still using observers to get an idea of the collision risk of, in this case, Cownose Rays. They avoid entering the wind farm here in general, but so there is an aggregation just outside of the wind farm. So very useful information, but still very difficult to obtain in practical terms. More and more of the work that is carried out in Europe, post-construction, is focused on collision risk, also pre-construction actually. And it is getting increasingly important to model collision risks, not only sort of on average, but also during different weather conditions. This is important in relation to protected species. So many of the constraints that projects are seeing today, they are related to protected species and the need to make sure that the collisions of these species are kept at an absolute minimum. I guess actually legislation in the US is at the forefront, so this is certainly also an issue in the US. In this example here, we have shown that this protected species of red kite in Europe, it actually is mainly at risk during headwinds, where it will be flying at the height of the rotor zone, while during tailwinds it actually fly above rotor height. So when we were actually designing the sensor system, or set up the ideal for a sensor system, we looked into the what we actually had, so using radars aided by observers or rangefinders, or using, for some digital aerial surveys. It was clear that the main problem with those available technologies is the temporal coverage. The collision risk that we see offshore is so much related to weather conditions, and we are only able to actually collect information during very small time windows with these three technologies. So that was the main sort of challenge that we saw, and that was why we decided a system based on deployment, so based on actually being in the wind farm 24/7 and recording both movements and also species all the time in the wind farm and also outside. So we have tried to achieve this by combining a scanning radar with a digital camera. This image here, or this slide, just can deploy a sensor system rather than just doing a survey or predicting. And so this is called during tailwinds and side winds, while during headwinds they can fly much lower. And there's also a tendency for the bird to increase height. That you need a lot of data. You need to collect the information during a wide range of conditions. The sensor system, which actually satisfied the project last year, is the need for high-resolution 3D data. The collision risk, of course, can be set to uniform for the whole rotor zone, but many seabirds, they fly relatively low, so that method tends to overestimate the collision risk. So by actually using high-resolution data on the actual flight height, you can make it a much more detailed and precise assessment of the collision risk. So that will actually require height Another important aspect is that the sensor system is efficient. So the criterion here, the need for data collection on multiple scales, means that collision risk has to be measured as a combination of behavioral avoidance at different scales, different distances from the wind farm. The macro avoidance is the avoidance of the wind farm in general. The meso avoidance is the avoidance of the individual turbines. And then the micro avoidance actually goes on in the roads as shown. So your sensors actually need to be able to record at all spatial levels. And then finally, and maybe the most important, is that your tracks generated by a sensor system are so accurate that you can actually align them precisely against the orientation of the rotor. This is an example of a flock of cranes moving through an offshore wind farm in the Baltic. And it shows that they actually clearly avoid the rotor, but they fly very close to it and just obliquely to the orientation of the rotor. So the spatial resolution of the tracks generated by a sensor system should be as high as possible. The sensor system was developed in a project managed by the Carbon Trust. There were two regulators, Marine Scotland and Crown Estate, and there were 10 developers, so the main developers in Europe, offshore developers, and they pulled in enough funding to develop the system, also deploy it. It's been running now for a year, and it will be running for. So this slide just shows the design. There are two stations in the wind farm with cameras working together with radar, and then we have actually combined that with a traditional system with observers working with radars in the periphery, just to be able to actually track bird movements at some distance out with the wind farm. And the main species, the target species covered are gannets, large gulls, and kittiwakes. With this design, it's been possible to cover all the different aspects of avoidance that you need in order to calculate collision risk. So the macro avoidance, the horizontal and vertical meso avoidance, so the avoidance of the individual turbines, and also the micro avoidance, and also recording actual collision events, which of course used as an evidence of whether your collision risk estimates are working or not. And using the different sensors, of course, means that you have different detection ranges. It's possible to combine the data and then generate one avoidance rate for each component and eventually come up with a collision risk for each target species. But the main sort of innovation, although we had this design to combine the automated recordings with observer-based recordings, the main innovation was the development of a system that was running with radars and cameras integrated. And the main part of that system is an FPGA. You have a camera that is slaving on a radar, so it follows all the recordings of bird echoes undertaken by the radar, and it records a film of the movement of that bird. The camera has to be able to actually respond instantly, so we're talking about microseconds. It has to be able to focus and zoom on the target and start recording. So this is running and gives, in this wind farm, a unit like this gives something like 10 films per day of bird behavior in the wind farm. So I think it's been amazing to see the amount of data that comes in as compared to what the observers with radar, to sort of the standard way that we have been doing things in the past, what they have been able to record. So the radar actually filters the echoes in relation to a known geometry for a bird pulse. So it's both in relation to the sort of the shape, but also the gradients and the size of the echo. And the information is then transferred to the camera. The camera consists of two infrared channels. You can see those two smaller camera lenses, and then with a larger lens in the center. That's the visual lens in the camera house. So I'll just show you an example of a film. I'm not able to show it from the Gannets test site actually, but from another test site, showing this is a thermal film, so it's taken during the night of a herring gull flying through a wind farm, and herring gull are avoiding the roller ship zones. I don't know whether you could see it, but it's just an example of the type of quality we can get with this type of camera. This is a FLIR camera, so this is a very strong camera that has a lot of endurance, can stand offshore conditions. So of course that's important for this type of data collection. When we think about the species detection and especially identification, there's a difference between the thermal and the visual lenses. With the visual lenses, you can in general identify most seabirds at a distance of around 600 to 700 meters. While for the thermal lens, it is often difficult to get a species level. Often you will have to be satisfied with a group, but you can identify groups to a distance of approximately 400 meters, which is satisfactory, I think. So this last slide is just to show the sort of the next generation where we have been able to solve the need to actually get flight height data. So it's two orthogonal radar antenna that are spinning together with the camera. So it gives us the camera will not only focus on the right angle and distance, but also the right inclination. That's where we are today with the system. So I think that's my last slide.
Great, thank you, Henrik.
Thank you.
We have one question that came in, and we have a couple other coming in as we speak. So, have you observed any significant differences in turbine avoidance at night versus day?
I'm not in a position to actually resolve or to say anything about that at the moment. I think we will be there, but it will be about 7 or 8 months from now. So we do not yet know. No, so that's one of the interesting aspects. So that has not been solved yet.
Okay. And this question is regarding your avoidance model. So can you please return briefly to your avoidance model and explain what macro, meso, and micro mean in this context? Is macro avoiding a wind farm or entering the wind farm or something else?
Yes, the macro avoidance is the tendency for birds to avoid the wind farm perimeter overall, so avoiding actually entering the wind farm. Meso avoidance is once the bird is in the wind farm, what is the tendency that it actually avoids actually getting close to the turbine. And finally, the micro avoidance, that actually happens in the rotor ship zone. So if it does actually fly into the rotor, does it, in the last second before a blade hits it, does it make some sort of reaction and makes it possible to avoid collision? So you have to combine all three in order to get an overall avoidance rate, which is used in these collision risk models.
Right. Okay. And just a reminder to all participants, if you do have any questions, please use the notes tab in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or if you're on the phone, just dial #2 on your telephone handset to be in the and ask a verbal question. One question for Kate that's kind of a higher level question, so you may or may not be able to answer this, but if you were asked to conduct a baseline survey of a similar geographic area, size, and types of taxa present, would you recommend utilizing all 5 of the methodologies that you discussed, or would a subset of those do?
Well, it depends on what your specific goals are, I would say. Each of those methods has some different strengths and gets you some different kinds of information. In terms of surveys, I thought the combination of the boat and aerial surveys was really nice, and they had some complementary capabilities in terms of which taxa they did a really good job of monitoring. If you are interested in looking at, specifically migrants and specifically animals that are going to be birds in particular that are going to be migrating nocturnally, then you can't just do diurnal surveys. You'll pick up on a few passions and shorebirds, but you're not going to get a handle really on what's going on. And so then you need to start looking at alternative approaches, like some of the stuff that Henrik was talking about, and looking at, weather radar and other options. Satellite telemetry, you end up with a really small sample size often, so there are some limitations there, but it's really nice complementary data to surveys because in addition to the survey data that kind of says, okay, here's the distribution of animals and, what numbers of animals are here, the telemetry data you can actually use to say, okay, given that you saw this northern gannet, in this location, or this group of northern gannets was in this location, would they actually be there tomorrow if you surveyed the next day instead of today, and you get more of a handle on how animals are using the area and sort of moving around. So I guess that's a long way of saying if you can do it, using a suite of complementary approaches is the best way to get a solid handle on sort of the baseline and what wildlife are doing.
Right. Okay. Henrik, one question for you is, this question is kind of aimed at whether or not you can talk about any radar interference with the actual wind farms and wind turbines themselves, and any difficulties you ran into utilizing these radar systems with among wind turbines.
Well, so far we have used both magnetron-based and also solid-state type radars in wind farms. I don't think we have ever had any complaints in terms of interference. If you have several radars working in a wind farm, you can have interference between them, but that again can be avoided. So at least I have not had any complaints from wind farm owners with respect to interference. But I think also in general, wind farm owners, they have shown an interest in having bird radars, or maybe even using the radars for other complementary services. They can use the radars, for example, to monitor hail or wind gusts or other things.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, are there any other questions from the participants? Okay. Well, if there are no more questions at this time, then I guess we can end a little early. I would just like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar, and thank you to Kate and Henrik for the excellent presentations. Again, these webinars will be posted on the WREN Hub site, and more information about WREN can be found on TTIS. And we are still working out the details for the next webinar, and so please stay tuned for more information on that in the near future. And so if there are no more questions this time, I'd like to again thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.